Hey Finxters, what's up? It's Chris, founder of Finxter.com, and in today's video you're going to learn about Python's built-in open function. While I'm going over all these built-in functions, there are 84 or so in Python, I constantly think, is this more like a more practical function, or is this a very important function, or is this not so important function? And like I'm asking this for all functions, and I would say this open function is one of the top 10 most frequently used built-in functions, and it's very important to understand. It's very powerful, and you will use it a lot of time in your practical code project. So I think it makes sense to watch this 10-minute video, to hold through the video, because I will show you some very interesting tricks and features of the Python open function. So let's maybe just do this by example, right? It's always easiest to learn things by example, and I always prefer it that way. Okay, so say we have a code shell like this, and maybe I show you the whole code shell. I usually don't do this to not confuse readers of or visitors of this channel, but I think it makes sense in this case. You see the code file is named code.py, and it's at some location on my computer, and now we can use the open function to open a file object in our Python code, and then we can, for example, read all the contents from this file or write contents into the file. So this basically helps us with the input and output, and the open function is really I would say the main approach in Python to communicate with the operating system. And I mean, you need to communicate with like either the print statement or the file IO, which means the open function. So there are only those two ways. So I think the print function and the open built-in functions, if you understand them, you have like tackled 90% of the use cases of how your program communicates with the outside world. There are other ways like the TCP connection to other servers and so on, but these are less frequently used. Okay, so for example, how would you go about this code function? So the easiest way to use the open function is to create a file object. Simply pass the name of the file object into the open function with one argument. So there's only one argument of the open function that you need to define, one non-optional argument. All the other arguments are optional, and we will look at only one other optional argument, which is the mode, because I think this is the most important one. And like I always love this 80-20 distribution. So I want to, like, in 20% of the time I want to teach 80% of the most important features, and I think we can do this in this video. Okay, so in this case we open a file object passing one string value, which is the name or the path to the file that you want to open, and we are already like this Python program is at this specific location here, yeah. And the name of this, so you see the path at the top of this code shell, and this file is named code.py. So basically, we want to, in this script, we open the file itself. Very interesting, yeah. So we create a file object, we open the code file itself, and now we read all lines. We can, for example, read and print all lines in this code file, yeah? So basically this code file has two lines. So basically what we are doing is we use the file object to access its own content, source code that reads its own source code when executed. It's very meta, I know, but I think it has a good learning effect. And if you run the code, you see we have a list of lines. So this is the first line, f object open code.py, and this is the second line. Okay, so for example, if you would another comment here like hello world, and we run it, you see now the comment appears at the end of our list as well. Okay, so this is how, like, very simply how you can access all the content of a file in your and load it into your Python program, and then of course you can do some post processing on the data you have just loaded into it. So I think this is the most important use case, and basically there's one argument called mode. It's an optional argument. Per default, it's in read-only mode. So per default, you can only read stuff from the file object. You cannot write into the file object. So Python needs to know this, because the operating system, like if you can also write stuff into the file, the operating system must ensure that if you have multiple writers, multiple, say, processes writing in the same file, it need to manage the access to avoid that there will be inconsistencies. For example, often, so one program may read the content of a file and based on the content it performs some computation and then write the content into another file, and another thread may do the same, read the content of a file, do some processing and then write new information. So say what happens if now one process reads the file content and then immediately after the other one reads it. Now the first process performs the computation and writes the result into it. And now the second process does the same, performs the computation and writes into it. And now the second one has overwritten the contents of the first one. So it's like they basically they could leverage each other out. So one process can basically there can be many inconsistencies. Basically, one process can assume I have written something into a file, but then the other one just overwrites it because like they run in parallel. So the operating system must manage this parallel access of the shared resource, which is the file, and therefore Python has introduced these different modes how to access file. And if two processes are in read-only mode, this doesn't really, it's very efficient. The operating system doesn't really care because they're just reading the data. They don't write into the shared resource. So therefore, it doesn't have to manage a lot. So therefore, it's like much more efficient to use the read-only mode. And per default, we are using read-only mode. So if you do this one, we actually get exactly the same output, as before. So basically, this is implicitly given. And you can also define a mode like as a positional argument, simply specifying the R character as the mode, because it's the second argument in the argument list. Okay, so these three alternatives are all the same. They are semantically identical. You read the file in read-only mode and you print all the content of the file to the Python shell. Sorry. Okay, so the next one, you may ask, how can I open a file and write something like a string into the file? And this can be easily done by switching to the write mode. So we basically now define the character W as the mode of accessing this file, and now we can also read stuff. So we can run the code as well. Okay, no, we can't. Okay, it's not readable. So okay, sure. Okay, no, I know. So we could do like read write, then we could write. Now this should work. No, it should be either one. Okay, so this is read only and the other one is write only. Okay, so in this case now this works again. Okay, great. So I just learned something out of it. So basically we need to, like, you can either read or write. And if we define W, we basically write into the file. And if you try to write, this is what I learned today, if you try to read, but you have a write only mode defined, Python gives you an unsupported operation, not readable. So I was confused because in many instances, if you have a write lock on a shared resource, usually you can also read. I mean, to me, it doesn't make sense why Python wouldn't allow this. But it's, of course, maybe it's about, like, Python allows the stuff that is expected by most developers. So therefore, maybe just not to violate the expectations, they have created this exception. But I think it doesn't make sense, because if you have the write lock, so if you have the rights to write to a file, then you should also have the rights to read the file, right? Okay, because reading is less strong and less intrusive than writing, basically. Okay, good. But anyway, if you have defined the write mode, then what you are probably wanting to do is to write stuff. So you can write, say, hello world, and now we don't write into this file, otherwise we would overwrite our own file but create a new one. Say we create a file youtube.txt. Okay, so this is now our new file name. We define the write mode and we simply write this string here given as an argument to the file object.write method. And of course we don't need to print this because it's just probably returns none. So if you execute the code, we should now see. So the code doesn't have any output, so I just run the code. It terminates without output, but now we can open the file structure. So this one is the folder where my file code.py resides, and I have a few other files here, and this file, you see, it's just like at my home, it's just 11.11 o'clock. So you see, it was a file. This file was just created, and if I open the file, it doesn't show anything. Why is that? Okay, yeah. Now it's very good. Like, actually, I wanted to show later that it's a good habit to close your file that you have just opened, and this can happen. I mean, you have seen what happens if you don't close the file. Then basically this write function itself, it just writes into a buffer. Then the buffer resides somewhere between the operating system and the real file object on the disk. And the operating system, it can hold this buffer in memory for a certain time. It doesn't flush it out into the file object itself. It just keeps it there, and it's like a to-do list for the operating system. But you cannot be sure that it was actually written in the file if you don't close it or flush it explicitly. So you can probably also flush it by calling file object.flush or so. But I mean, you can also just close the file object, and this will then cut the connection between your Python program and the file object. And therefore, as you like manually cut the connection, the operating system sees, okay, now this must be done. And before the close function, before the Python program returns the control back from the close function, you can already be sure that it was flushed into the file, and the file actually does contain the content hello world. Okay, so let's execute this again. And now if we open the same file, now it tells me the program has changed. I accept, and now we see our hello world arising in our youtube.txt file. Okay, so this works greatly, and this allows you to actually write some content to a file. But now what happens if we write another? So we already have this existing file, right? This youtube.txt file. Now what if you want to write another string into it? Say we write hi universe, and now we execute this code. We don't see any output, but if we load the file, it tells us, okay, it has changed. So let's have a look. Now there's only the string hi universe in the file. The previous string hello world has disappeared. So actually, this is using the open function in the write mode is very dangerous, because per default you just overwrite all the contents in this file. So if the file already has some valuable content that you determined previously, you just overwrite it. Each time you call object.write, you overwrite all the stuff that was previously placed into the function. So I found that in many cases you don't want to do this. In many cases you actually just want to append the stuff. So for example, if you have two strings, after closing it, so actually in most cases I just go from there. In most cases you just want to append an string element or string content to the end of the file, right? You don't want to overwrite the whole file, you just want to append stuff. And if this is what you are doing, then you should use the append mode with the A character. And in this case, let's run this program and open the youtube.txt file. Now you see it has written hi universe twice without new line, so probably we also want to add the new line here. And if you run it, it should have written the new line a third time in a new line, right? And so on. So we can even change it like this manually, forcefully. Now you see two different processes changing the same shared resource. So my notepad editor changes the YouTube file, and also the Python program changes the YouTube file. So both change the same shared resource. So the operating system needs to do some management to ensure that the file content will still be consistent, and those two processes don't write in parallel on the shared resource. And good. And for example, we can also, in our Python program, call the write function multiple times. Say hi universe 2 and hi universe 3. And if you run this, we now see this output, okay? And again, if we now switch back to the write mode and run the program, and we open, you see that it only writes everything before the close function. So everything. So it actually writes it writes all the strings that you pass in a write function call within your Python program. But as soon as the Python program terminates and you close the file and everything, it basically, next time you open the file, you open it again you open a fresh file that overrides the previous file. So I think these are the 3 most important takeaways. So you can open any file in read mode with the character R. You can open it in the write mode with the character W. Then in this case, it will overwrite the contents of the file. And you can open it in append mode with the character A. And in this case, it will just append it to the end of the file if the file already exists. If the file doesn't exist, it just behaves just as the W, the write mode, basically. Okay, so I think that's enough for today. And for the open function, this is like, in most cases, you just need to do this. You need to know how to open a file object, how to use the file object to write and read stuff, and how to close the file object. I mean, what else? There are many different details. Like you can write different types of data, like bytes and byte string and so on. You can have all the different modes. So I can even show you like different modes that are theoretically possible. So here we can have reading mode, we can have a writing mode with the W character, but you can also have this exclusive creation mode, X, and this basically defines like it's a variant of the writing mode, but it fails if the file already exists. So sometimes you just want to throw an error to prevent that the file is even modified. In this case, you would use the X mode. I seldomly use it. Most of the time I use either append mode or write mode. Sometimes read mode if it is performant, if I want to read content. And binary mode, of course, I mean, you can write binary, and per default it's in text mode. So default you write text, not binary, not like bits and bytes into the file. Per default you write text, like strings. And okay, and here's this plus, so we can also have reading and writing. This is probably what I've looked for. So you can define an R plus W, and then it allows you to read and write both. And then you can have many different arguments, like define how the buffering behaves, what is the encoding you are using, Unicode, ASCII code. You can define like new line characters you want to allow, and what happens if it is closed, and so on. So you can even define your own file opening objects, file opener objects, and you can like do all stuff. But actually, I seldomly use them myself, and I very seldomly see that other people use these other different arguments. And you can also check it out. I mean, if you just need it, then a quick Google search will give you the information you are looking for. But I think these 3 things, these you should know without searching Google, just for your coding productivity, because it happens so often. So just call the open function on the file name, then define the mode, and that's it. The mode can be like 3 things, can be A, W, or R. And it gives you, it's like the first character of the mode, the read mode, the write mode, or the append mode. And then you just use the write and read lines, write or read function. You can use read, which will read the whole file object, like all the contents of the file as one string, or you can use read lines to get a list of strings line by line. And then after using it, you would simply close the file object. So this is the most frequent use. 99% of the use cases probably we have covered now. Thanks for listening to this video, and see you in the next video. Bye.